All right, welcome everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to today's Orthodox Christian Attorney Network webinar on Confidentiality of Confessions by Archdeacon Justin Bozel. A few quick words of introduction. I'm Deacon Ken Liu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Orthodox Christian Attorney Network. If you're new to us, OCAN is an organization of Orthodox attorneys with a threefold mission of helping attorneys to integrate our faith into the practice of law, to serve the Orthodox Church, and to make an impact on the world with the love of Christ. And today I am very pleased to host my friend and colleague, Archdeacon Justin, for a talk on this topic of great importance to the Church, confidentiality of confessions in the Orthodox canonical tradition and its legal challenges. As you all know, confession is a sacred tradition in the Orthodox Church, one of our holy sacraments. And traditionally, civil law has respected the sacredness of confession and guarded its confidentiality through the clergy penitent privilege. But there are tensions on this issue between protecting confidentiality of information revealed in confession and the desire to use such information in legal proceedings. And specifically, where this is coming to a head is in the area of youth protection. In most states, clergy are deemed to be mandatory reporters of child abuse. That means if they come across information leading to a reasonable suspicion of child abuse, they are required by law to report it. But in most of these states, laws grant exceptions for information revealed under the clergy penitent privilege. But recently, there have been attempts to chip away at this exception by limiting the circumstances in which the privilege applies. As many of you know, youth protection is an issue very dear to me and here to all of us at OCAN. In collaboration with the Orthodox Youth and Young Adult Ministries, we've prepared a model youth protection policy for use by jurisdictions that don't have a policy. And so we're certainly very sympathetic to the importance of protecting youth from abuse. But we're also wary of any intrusion against this sacred practice of the Church. And so I'm pleased to have Archdeacon Justin here today to help us understand the issues underlying this practice. Archdeacon Justin, he was a personal injury and trial lawyer for 2 decades, so he's very well versed in the law. He also has an MDiv and is currently in the Master's of Theology program at Holy Cross Seminary. And in 2023, he began serving full-time with the Greek Orthodox metropolis in San Francisco. And so he's, of course, very well versed in church practices as well. If you have any questions for Deacon Justin, please type them in the chat box. And depending on the timing and the context, we may either field them right away or we may wait till the end of the presentation. Without further ado, thank you, Deacon Justin, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Father Deacon. I appreciate it. And thank you all for taking time out of either your lunch break or the beginning of your workday to be with us today to talk. So, the primary focus of this talk is to look at the canonical tradition of confidentiality within Orthodoxy and the history of that tradition. But as Deacon Ken suggested, what really kicked this off is the eroding of some of the clergy penitent privilege that we see in certain states. So in just about every state and territory, clergy are listed as mandatory reporters. But in at least 10 states and territories right now, the clergy penitent privilege is denied in cases of suspected child abuse and/or neglect. So in other words, if you're a priest and someone comes to you and says, I have committed some form of child abuse or neglect, under those state laws, you are required to leave that confession and call the authorities immediately, right? Which, as you can see, immediately becomes a serious problem for our practice of confidentiality and confession. So in particular, right, it's in Guam, New Hampshire, West Virginia, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Tennessee, Texas, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands. Um, the state of Louisiana, there was a challenge that went all the way up to its Supreme Court several years ago, and eventually the Supreme Court determined that the law was not meant to address the clergy penitent privilege, and so they kind of punted on the issue. But it may come up again. And there have been challenges in other states where they have attempted to do away with the clergy penitent privilege in these cases that have not yet passed through the legislature, but I think we can anticipate that those challenges will keep coming back. And so this is the framework that began my investigation into the canonical tradition in this regard. I want to reiterate what Deacon Ken said at the beginning. I'm not in any way suggesting that there are problems with clergy mandatory reporting law or mandatory reporting laws in general, or having clergy as mandatory reporters. I want to be very clear and upfront that I support youth protection policies and laws, and when it comes to these things, I'm reminded of the gospel verse, right? That if somebody were to scandalize one of these little ones, better for them to have had a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into the sea. This is not meant to in any way suggest that I don't support mandatory reporting laws in general. However, it becomes a problem when we start to look at issues of the confessional practice. Queensland, Australia is an example of where we may find ourselves ending up, right? In Queensland, Australia, a law was passed saying that every adult is a mandatory reporter. A person is deemed accountable if they have the power or responsibility to remove or reduce the risk and willfully or negligently fails to remove or reduce the risk. You have an affirmative duty to act in a way to prevent the abuse from occurring. And it does not matter that the knowledge was gained by the accountable person during or in connection with a religious confession. So the law there not only imposes an affirmative duty on everybody, they very explicitly exclude the clergy penitent privilege from applying in that context. Now, we don't have laws that are quite to that degree in the United States, but this might be a harbinger of kind of where the law ends up developing in time. There's no question in the Orthodox Church that we all kind of agree that confession is supposed to be confidential, but many times the statements that you see in that regard are entirely conclusory. So there was a report, for example, given to the OCA Synod of Bishops in 1988, where then Bishop Peter simply states, secrecy of confession was already a commonly accepted doctrine in ancient Russia, as the fact is evidenced by the well-known canonist Pavyov. According to the author who also wrote the Pedalion, a priest who betrays the secrecy of confession is to be deposed. There's no citation to any specific canons, right? No any actual authority cited for this conclusory statement. Similarly, in the guidelines for clergy by the OCA in 2023, the secrecy of the mystery of penance, even under strong constraining influence, is considered an unquestionable rule in the entire Orthodox Church. Betrayal of the secrecy of confession will lead to canonical punishment of the priest. The Antiochian Archdiocese Clergy Guide from 2011, a confessor must keep everything he is told in strictest confidence. The confessor must evaluate the legal ramifications of what is told him in confession. The confessor must consider whether the law would require him to report what has been told to him in confession to the authorities. If he believes the law may require him to go to the authorities, he must seek the advice and counsel of his bishop. Very conclusory and summary. And that's fine in terms of a priest in the field functioning. But if, for example, a priest were to be held civilly or criminally liable for not reporting something he learns in confession, this is probably on its face not going to pass constitutional muster alone, right? In challenging that requirement. The Catholic Church has been very much at the forefront of this issue because their canonical tradition, which is much more codified is very clear, coming out of some of their councils in the 11th century, where for them to disclose anything that is learned in confession under any circumstance in any way not only results in the automatic deposition of the priest, but also in his excommunication. It's very strong, very explicit, and very clear. Anyone who knows anything about the Orthodox canonical tradition knows that generally our canonical tradition is not nearly so cut and dried or clear always. Um, for us, the canons are the application of our teaching in particular times and particular places to address particular issues. And so they tend to be much more almost anecdotal in that sense. And so we have to sort of distill from it its application in other circumstances like what we're dealing with here. Um, a word, let me double check. Yeah, a word before I get to the canons on the history of confession. So there's this often stated, I would almost call it urban legend out there, that you hear said, in the early church, confession was public and private confession only came later. Okay. Have people heard that one before in some form or another? Um, that's only kind of sort of true. So, certainly coming out of the third century and the issue of the Roman persecutions against Christians, there were a lot of Christians that lapsed. They denied Christ under the threat of torture or martyrdom. And the church had to deal with the issue of how do we bring them back? How do we bring them in? Can we bring them in? Right? We see people like St. Cyprian of Carthage and many others dealing with that particular issue. And what develops out of that, especially in the third century, is this public penitential system. And it eventually expands to include other kinds of very public sins. So, uh, murder or other kinds of killing, sexual immorality, certain other kinds of sins that had a much more public character to them. And there would be types of penance dealing with that. Fasting, time away from communion. Usually it involved having to stand in a special place, either in the narthex or outside the church, doing prostrations as people came in. It was this very public penitential system. That didn't necessarily mean that the confessions themselves were made publicly. So we see, for example, in the time of St. Nectarios, Patriarch of Constantinople, in the I think it's the early 5th century, there was actually a priest who was designated as the presbyter penitentiary in Constantinople. And his job was to receive these confessions and then would impose the penance. The penance was done publicly, the confession itself was not. But there was this rather public penitential system. At the same time, we see things from homilies by Origen, by St. John Chrysostom, and by others, encouraging lay people to see their priest, to talk about their sins with their priest confidentially, and to receive spiritual healing and therapy as a result of his advice. What today most of us think of confession as being, right? And that was much more practiced in the monastic tradition. We see that with the Desert Fathers, with St. Basil, with St. Benedict, and so on, this very robust tradition of monastics confessing to their spiritual father, not only their sins, but their thoughts, and receiving advice and therapy for that. But it also existed for lay people, just maybe not as widespread or as common as it is today. So I say all of that um, as a little bit of a prelude, because what we see then is the canons are addressing those historical situations. It's not until probably the period of iconoclasm, somewhere around probably the second period of iconoclasm, 9th century roundabout, with the influence of the Studites and others, that we start to see a very robust practice of lay people going to private confession regularly in a way somewhat akin to the way monastics had been doing for a long time. Um, anyway, I needed to give a little bit of that historical background in order for us to understand what we're going to see in some of the canons. So, one of the primary canons that addresses confidentiality of confession is Basil 34. This is from one of the canonical letters of St. Basil the Great. And he says, as to women who have committed adultery and have confessed on account of fear of God, or in some way having felt shame, our fathers have forbidden us to disclose it, so that examining the women, we do not offer up cause for their death, but they ordered that they be stood without communion until the time of their repentance is completed. Okay. As the medieval canonical commentator Balsamon gets into, and I won't read all of this right now, but basically what he's suggesting here is that the point is, under Roman law, in some circumstances, a husband could actually kill his wife for having committed adultery. Or at a minimum, it made her life very, very difficult and complicated. And so he's saying when a woman comes and has committed adultery and confesses it to you, don't disclose it and find a way to penance her in such a manner that her husband won't know what she's being penanced for, right? Don't subject her to harm for having gone to confession. And this principle actually we see at play even in modern times. There's an anecdote from St. Porphyrios where a woman comes to him and confesses that she's committed adultery, and he discerns that her husband was waiting outside the church. And if he saw that she didn't receive communion because she was under penance, he planned to kill her. And St. Porphyrios says, normally I would give you a penance and not allow you to have communion because of your sin of adultery. But what I'm going to do is instead tell you that you have to come to liturgy every week for the next period of years, and you'll receive communion once a month only during that time as a way to protect her from her husband's anger and still give her a certain penance for the healing of her soul. Okay. But the principle at play here is don't subject someone to harm for having confessed, right? Don't let the fact that they've gone to confession be what results in additional external harm. In Carthage 132, 141, we see a similar principle at play regarding a bishop who excludes from communion someone who confesses to him a private sin. Likewise, it is good that if ever a bishop says that someone confessed to him alone a sin, and that person denies it, the bishop should not consider it as a personal insult because only he is not believed, even if, because of the offense and troubled by his own conscience, he says he does not want to commune with the one who denied it. So, what's it talking about here? If there's a situation where a person is denying something that he's confessed to his bishop, the bishop is not allowed, in particular, to testify against him or to disclose the fact that he has confessed that sin to him. And if the bishop is so troubled by the penitent's denial publicly of the sin that he's privately confessed, that the bishop doesn't want to receive communion in the same liturgy as this person, as uh, some of the medieval commentators actually get into, they say that bishop is no longer allowed to serve, right? If he's using the knowledge of a private confession as the basis for wanting to not commune from the same chalice as somebody who had previously confessed to him, that bishop is just be suspended for a time and penanced himself, right? That's how serious that confidentiality is, and the trust that he's given in hearing the confession. Now, fast forward a little bit, and we start getting into canons that start arising in the 9th and 10th century, attributed to St. Nicephorus the Confessor. There's questions about whether the extent to which he actually wrote them, or whether they were simply attributed to him. But we see this is from that time period where we're starting to see a lot more private confessions from lay people. And there's a whole penitential system now developing on that basis, the canons of John the Faster and others. And in Nikephoros, we see the one receiving the confession of secret transgressions by penitents ought to exclude them from communion, but should not prevent them from entering the church. Also, he should not divulge the sins, but advise them gently, encourage their repentance, and patiently guide and administer appropriate reprimands to them according to one's discretion. And you can see this is effectively what we still do in our practice today, right? If somebody confesses a sin that requires penance, they're not told you can't come to church anymore, right? They're allowed to enter the church, to stand with everyone else, but they may be told not to receive communion for a time. The priest is also told, don't divulge the sins, give them gentle advice that leads to their repentance, right? Similarly, adulterers, bestiality offenders, murderers, and those like them, if they confess their own lawlessness, the sin being hidden to many, they are prohibited from communion and receive reprimand when entering the church. They stand until the prayer of the catechumens. If, however, their deeds are publicly known, then, according to the ecclesiastical practices, they fulfill the penances. Right. So there's still some remnant of that more public penitential system there. And basically, the principle is if their sins are not known, don't penance them in such a way that people would guess what their sin likely was. If, on the other hand, their sin was very public, then you can go ahead and penance them in that more public way, right? There's a principle there of discretion, of hiding or protecting the sins of the people who have confessed. Another one attributed to Nikephoros, it is a sacrilege to expel someone from a church in such a manner that spiritual fathers bear witness to what they have learned in secret. And accordingly, for that reason, they are designated as detestable, excommunicated, and anathematized by their very testimony. For it is absolutely forbidden for a mediator to say or in any way manifest those things that belong to confession. This is one of the strongest admonitions and canons against the disclosure of confession that we find. And incidentally, the Eastern Catholic Code of Canon Law cites this as one of the main sources for their prohibition of disclosing confession. This one, we don't know exactly, again, the year that this comes about, but it's likely sometime in the 10th or 11th century that we see this canon coming into play. And then finally, at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, they have a codex of an anonymous 13th century canonical compilation that includes a canon. Should a presbyter or monk accept someone for confession, and that priest or monk turns and confesses those things openly before people, let him be deposed. All right. Much more clear and direct in that regard. As we continue on, we get into the Slavic tradition in the Nomo canon of Patriarch Joseph in 1650. They say the spiritual father, if he reveals to anyone the sin of one who had confessed, receives a penance. He shall be suspended from serving for 3 years, being able to receive communion only once a month, and must do 100 prostrations each day. The civil law says, dig up his tongue from the root. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. He then also basically references the canon of Carthage that I mentioned before. Even if a bishop or priest confesses a sin against his spiritual son, which is heard from him in confession, it is no way proper to believe the testimony, according to Canon 133 of the Council of Carthage. Right? So even if the priest does go ahead and disclose it, you're not to believe it. You're just to ignore it completely. So this civil law, dig up his tongue from the root, that's a pretty remarkable thing to see. And I first read that, I went through literally volumes and volumes of 19th century reproductions of medieval canonical and civil law texts and could not find that law. And I was racking my brain, pulling my hair out, because it gets cited again in St. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountains Rudder in the 18th century. And I'm going, man, they're citing it again. Where is this coming from? I can't find it anywhere. And I was very relieved to learn that I'm not the only one who couldn't find it. St. Dmitri of Rostov also tried to find it. And here's how he explains where that comes from. He says, according to our nomo canon, a priest who reveals the sins that were revealed to him during confession is subject to a twofold punishment, canonical and criminal. The first one consists of a 3-year prohibition from ministry. This punishment is determined based on an apocryphal regulation of the Seventh Synod attributed to St. Ephrem the Syrian. However, in reality, this regulation originates from the latest church practice described above. In other words, canons like Nikephoros that we were talking about before. The second punishment, criminal, is striking in its exquisite cruelty. It is determined by some civil or temporal law. This law ordered that the tongue of any priest who discloses sins revealed to him in confession should be torn out from behind. We cannot find this particular law in any of the codes of Byzantine civil laws. Phew. If Saint Demetri couldn't find it, I'm not an idiot. Most likely, the authors of the Nomocanon applied the law of Procuron, the Procuros Nomos, a Byzantine civil law collection, about false oath and perjury to the priest who violated the sacrament of confession. In fact, the authors considered the priest's sin even more severe and found it necessary to replace the mere cutting out of the tongue with digging out the tongue from behind or from the root. It's not without reason that the latest Greek canonical jurists compared this punishment to be equal to the death penalty. So, in other words, there was a law in the books against false oath and perjury, which required that the tongue be cut off. And it seems that these canonical drafters take that law and apply it to disclosing confession, but even further by saying that it should be dug out. There's no actual evidence that that penalty has ever been imposed, but it's a dramatic emphasis of the degree to which we value confidentiality in confession. What's interesting is how this is played out in various Orthodox countries and nations. So, for example, in the spiritual regulation of Tsar Peter I in the 1722 appendix, the law provided, I should say, that law did, in general, enshrine in Russian civil law the confidentiality of confession. It recognized that that was the canonical tradition and enshrined it in civil law. But it had an exception. If someone in confession informs his spiritual father of some illegality that has not yet been committed, but that he yet intends to commit, especially treason or mutiny against the sovereign or against the state, or evil designs upon the honor or well-being of the sovereign and upon his majesty's family, and in informing of such a great intended evil, he reveals himself as not repenting, but considers himself in the right, does not lay aside his intention, and does not confess it as though it were a sin, but rather so that his confessor's assent or silence he might become confirmed in his intention, then the priest is required to disclose that information to the civil authorities. Okay. So, in other words, if somebody comes to the confession and says, I intend to commit a crime in the future, then under this civil law in Russia, the priest was required to reveal that to the civil authorities. And there was at least one situation where somebody did potentially confess their intentions to a priest. A priest did not disclose it, and the priest was severely punished by the government for that. Okay. This law resulted in a lot of turmoil within the Russian clergy and the Russian government at the time over how to comply with it, because there's a broader context. They also at the same time mandated confession to all Russian citizens on a regular basis. And so they mandate confession and then tell the priests, if anybody says anything relating to any potential for illegality, you have to tell the authorities. You can imagine how that creates sort of a problem with the church feeling like they've become an arm of a police state. There was a lot of turmoil there. You can find a number of books written on this topic. Um, but I think from everything that we've seen, both from the canons and from the way that the spiritual regulation of Tsar Peter is written, because what is the spiritual regulation basically saying? If you come saying that you're going to commit a crime in the future, you're not repenting and you're not confessing. You're not really penitent, and so therefore the sacramentality and confidentiality of confession doesn't apply, is the implication of the spiritual regulation. Again, that was very controversial within Russia during the time, um, but that was sort of the peace that at least some bishops made with it, was that if somebody comes to you and is confessing what they plan to do without repenting, rather than maybe what they've done in the past, then that's not really a confession that you're bound to hold confidential. Um, the upshot of it all, though, is that I think there are a few principles that we can draw from these canons in evaluating how we respond to these laws. The first question is, would divulging the confession lead to public shame and or civil penalties for the penitent? Right? And that's the basic principles from Basil 34 and from Nikephoros 27 and 28. Two, would divulging the confession have a chilling effect on others confessing their sins? Many of the commentaries on these canons say that a primary purpose for guarding the confidentiality of confession is to encourage people to confess. And not only the person confessing, but even the other Christians around them, knowing that the priest maintains confidentiality of confession, they're more comfortable coming to confession themselves. And then third, is there clear evidence that the person confessing is not repentant at all and intends to commit a sin in the future the priest is expected to report, right? Um, if a person is truly coming to you just to get it off their chest that I'm going to go do this, and they're not interested in repenting of it, they show no signs of repentance, is that really a confession at all, right? And that's a hard one. I mean, I think that's one you would especially need to be talking with your bishop about. But I think these are the three basic principles that we can draw. Now, I think as a general matter, in light of these questions, if um, if somebody comes to you and says, "I uh, abused a child," right, and they're truly repentant for that, and they say, "I have no desire to ever do this again." First of all, that's a confession, right? There's no question about that. And it puts the priest in a very difficult position, but I think that in that context, he cannot go to the civil authorities because to disclose that confession would lead to both the public shame and civil/criminal penalties for the person who has confessed that they would not have faced necessarily had they not gone to confession. Right? Now, there may be other ways that a priest can sort of address the issue, right? Go ask to do a house blessing at the house of the person who's being abused or has been abused and see if there are other things that might lead him to report, not relating to the confession itself. Um, there are certainly some bishops, for example, who say that you are allowed to refuse absolution until such time as the person has turned themselves in, right? That's not you disclosing to the authorities, that's them disclosing, self-reporting, right? There can be situations like that. Um, but disclosing it oneself in that circumstance becomes very problematic. Um, I think realistically, so anyway, I think you can see why these mandatory reporting laws can become quite difficult and complicated for us because it can run into this duty of confidentiality for the priest. I think realistically, the way that this probably would play out, which I haven't seen any cases of actually happening, is a situation where somebody confesses to a priest of prior abuse. The priest doesn't say anything about it, and then down the road, um, it becomes public in some other way, and either the priest is being compelled to testify about that confession, or more probably is either civilly or criminally prosecuted for having failed to report it at the time. All right. I haven't seen those cases come up yet, and I pray that we don't have those kinds of situations, but theoretically that could happen, and then I think we would have a First Amendment challenge that we would need to bring. But I think what also concerns me is that when you start to see the priest penitent privilege carved out in places where it has historically been and specifically excluded, that concerns me that we're headed down a road where there's a legislative will to erode that protection in maybe a more general sense. And I think we need to be pretty vigilant about how these laws are being drafted and the extent to which priest penitent privilege is being carved out. I'm going to stop there. I know I threw a whole lot out there, but I want to open it up for questions, but also for some discussion. Um, you know, do we think that this is a strong enough defense of our First Amendment right not to disclose confessions? Are there other challenges out there that we think might be coming down the road from this? Am I misreading the situation? I'd love to have a little bit of a discussion on that as well.